is an arm's length body of government, and this slide shows our strategy for the next 8 years, if government will allow us for that. And at the top, very much what you see is an outcome focus. We're really focused on delivering physical and mental well-being and improving the individual, the community that they work in, and from that, the economic halo that goes around that activity. We do it on the left-hand side by understanding where people are on the journey towards active engagement with physical activity. And one of the barriers often with sport, particularly in this country, is that we're very supply focused. We give people the solution, yet we don't know where they are on that journey. So they might be at the contemplating stage, and we're giving them an all-action solution, which then doesn't. Our work and our investment into 7 particular areas that we hope will drive people, give them an opportunity, give them choice. We don't mind what activity they do as long as they are achieving the government thresholds for being active, and therefore levering from that the best solutions for the country and inward investment as well, as I'll show you in a minute. So we start with the customer, and what we really want to do is understand the different sorts of customers, the audience, rather than the activity. And then we want to understand the insight that's going to give us some clues as to what is the likely intervention that will succeed with that audience where they are on that behaviour change journey. So we really need a combination of factors that we'll see on this slide. We really need to drive by the intelligence where that audience is. We need to see how we get them across that journey to activity. So we need to see what behaviour change we need to influence that audience to get to a sustained amount of activity that we can achieve to do it. We need to see what motivates them, and of course what doesn't motivate them, where those barriers are and how we can address them. Just ploughing them with solutions when we're not addressing the barriers is not the right way to approach it. And that's where some of the failures have been in the past. So we really need that audience insight. We really need to understand. We need to share collectively. I think there's a great deal of collective knowledge within this room that we could share better than we do now. I think the international barriers are areas that we can overcome, for instance. We need to develop those offers. We need to see how successful they are. We need to promote the ones that succeed. We need to abandon the ones that are failing far sooner than we do at the moment. And then we need to track the changes so that we can influence inward investment from colleagues in health and social services that have far higher budgets than we do in sport in this country. So we say you've really got to have this journey. So you've got to have that line of sight between the audience and the outcomes. You've really got to keep that in place when you're looking at the target audience and then when you're planning the particular project. What is it that you're trying to achieve with that project? Why is that the right solution for what you're trying to achieve? And how does that deliver the outcomes on the left-hand side? And how can you measure it on the right-hand side? If you can't measure it, if you can't gather the data to prove the concept, then you're really selling it short as a way of proceeding. So this is a typical behaviour change model. People say to me, oh, well, this is 1970s thinking. Well, for the sport and physical activity, this is still quite a new focus. So we don't need to become complicated on behaviour change. But what we often see in the market is that people are selling to themselves. If you're an active person, you design your products and services, your interventions to sell to yourself. And a lot of the audiences are in very different places to those products and services. Now, you'll hear tomorrow about the outdoor sector, and what we found there in the research that we did there was that we were probably selling to 3% of the potential market. And no wonder that we weren't getting growth within that market. Now that we've got the market segmentation, we've got the knowledge, we've got the data, we can really structure things on this behaviour change journey. So we can break down some of the barriers to change so that we move people from that contemplation stage through the preparation stage to the activation, and that experience is good enough, it's addressing the barriers, so that we get them to that maintenance stage. So a lot of our research is embedded with our Active Lives survey. This surveys 200,000 people a year on their habits, and we can then break it down by district, we can break it down by individuals, and we can analyse then, and then we can apply it to a local area. So we know from that data how well we're doing, how well the interventions are doing, how the location, for instance, makes a difference to people's activity. This is all open data, so this is all available on our website. All the links are there for it, and underneath it lies a great deal of analysis. But one of our underlying themes for all of this is to share, make open the data, to drive the initiatives, to drive a different way of thinking to the market. And there's a lot to go for. The Active Lives data shows us that against the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines of the minimum of 30 minutes activity in 10-minute chunks, we've still got 25% of our adult population in this country that are not achieving that. At the other extreme, we've got 60% of the population that are doing 150 minutes a week, which is great, but we need to maintain that habit on that behaviour change. We don't need them to drop away from that, and there's a huge amount of churn within that number, which is inefficient to the system. And then we've got the middle bit, the 13.7%. So still a very large number in the population, some 6 million people, that are not achieving that 150 minutes a week. Now that's quite a daunting prospect. When you analyse that, 650,000 of those people are within about 10 minutes of achieving that 150 minutes a week. So actually there's some real encouragement that if we get the right interventions, in that case it's either they're not doing it at the right level of activity, they're not getting to that moderate intensity, or they're just not doing it for quite long enough. So encourage them to do the one more step on the one bus stop on walking, for instance, and you'll get them over that threshold. So actually there's quite a soft target there of 650,000 people that I think relatively easily, as long as it's properly designed, we can get considerable more activity. But the great thing about this is that we've got the evidence, we've got the measurements, so we can see how effective some of our interventions are. One of the big messages for us is that we don't need to think in isolation. We talk a lot about whole system change, and what we're doing is working with places, particularly with Birmingham. We've been on a mutual journey now for some years, and we're looking at further local pilots across the country to see how we can join up people, see how we can make sport and physical activity an intervention that drives across agendas. It's a mutual objective. We think that it has a very good return on investment for a lot of programs around social change, certainly around health, for instance. So if we can have the evidence, in the end, the sustainable position is somebody else will pay for that activity in the long term because they see the benefits on their own budget, on their own interventions, on their own targets. One of the challenges we've had is people to think within this whole system approach. People think in isolation, they think in silos, they think in sort of beleaguered areas. They're fighting day to day to get the grant funding, to keep the activity open, to keep the centre going, and we need to think a little bit more joined up, and our local pilots hopefully will start to do that. So they'll think not only of the person, but will think about their social environment, their friends, their family, how they influence and become some of those barriers to activity, for instance. How the organisations at the moment are a little bit fragmented, how can we join them together, how can we share best practice so people don't repeat the failures and certainly do repeat the successes. How do we create that right physical environment that's not just new shiny leisure centres, That's getting them out on the bit of grass that's probably 50 yards away from their front door, using the outdoors, as you'll hear tomorrow, as a real opportunity for getting people active, active commuting and all the other areas that we can really drive that physical environment. And then the policy areas, how can we overcome some of the constraints that local and central government, organisations like Sport England with the technical standards, how can we overcome some of those barriers to thinking more holistically, thinking more flexibly, thinking towards those audiences. This is an evaluation framework. None of that activity is worth it if you can't evaluate it, if you can't measure it, if you can't learn the lessons from it, and if you can't share that knowledge with that whole system so that other people can benefit. So we're not repeating the mistakes, we're not all going up that same learning curve, we're really building on the best practice. One of the things we've seen from the local pilot studies that we've been on in the last few weeks is there are, everywhere in this country, there are real pockets of excellence. We're not inventing something from a blank sheet of paper here. We know that there are interventions that work. We need to be able to publicise that, learn the lessons from them, and take them to scale so that we can really see that benefit beyond little pockets within the country, and how can we get that to a whole system change nationally and internationally as well. So part of our challenge then is to use the funding to stimulate this market. So on the left hand side, it's about exciting the consumer through campaigns such as this Girl Can. I'll show you a couple of slides of that in a minute. But then also following that up with the supply side to make sure that our outlets, that our B2B relationships are there, so that when those people who've got their aspirations through the campaign are not then disappointed when they get to the experience. So we've all seen how we can generate additional activity, and then you walk in and you find that there's a surly receptionist that doesn't understand, and you're put off before you ever get to the actual experience itself. There's no follow-up after feedback from the customer. So it has to be much more joined up. There's no point in campaigning if then the supply side isn't able to turn the aspirations of the consumer into the experience that will bring them to a point where they'll get to that maintenance area on the behaviour change. So we do have to think more holistically, we have to share best practice, we have to challenge ourselves to transfer the messages into the activity itself. So this Girl Can's been a fairly successful campaign. It really was recognising that from the research, a lot of the barriers for the female audience was one of judgment. Judgment of my ability to be active, and judgment on what I look like. You know, I'm not there with the Lycra Brigade. You know, I'm a newcomer. How will I feel? What will the experience will be? It's been successful. It's the challenge really is to now activate those messages right across the market, so that we can use that brand as a means of saying, if you turn up to this activity class, these are the qualities of the experience that you will get. Hopefully that will then deliver long-term experience that will keep those people motivated. So, what's success for us? Well, it's these series of things really. For us, it's that capacity and capability. We really want to make sure that we enhance and develop the market. We share those best practices. We don't all fall down the same hole of failure. Really understanding this approach. How can we break down the barriers between the silo delivery that we've got now and get that to some sort of scale? You've really got to make sure that in everything we do, from one end the audience, what is my audience, not the activity, but what is the audience, and at the other end, how is it going to influence those outcomes? Because those outcomes are our sales pitch into other people's budgets. Those outcomes are very much common with the health and with the social practitioners. So if we can sell them a cost-effective intervention onto their agendas, there's a long-term sustainability to be had from that activity delivering right across a number of agendas. So the evidence must be used. It's no good us as sport and activity people saying sport is great for everybody. We need to prepare and present evidence for that audience. So if we're talking to a health practitioner, we need to talk in clinical terms, for instance, and we need to measure it against where their norms are, not against where our norms are. So it's very important to build, to gather, and to analyse the data that we get collectively to make those business cases for further investment. And if that works, the whole system working together for a common purpose, then we'll succeed in getting a lot more people moving in a sustainable long-term fashion. Thank you very much.